There's no guarantee that the next day it's not very different. So that shows we have already some sense the potential for this body to create physical suffering is there. It's ever present. That's why this is called a truth of suffering. And then our mind. Yes, please?
I see contradiction, but maybe I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Because you say that a physical suffering, but you said before that the suffering is a mental state.
Ah, good point, good point. Okay. A physical suffering, I called it a physical suffering, and still I'm saying it is a state of mind. Yes, Vanda? Because, you see, when you say, for example, a pain in your leg, right? If you, for example, you meditate, right? You meditate, or you have one right now. Yes, we all do at some point, sooner or later. So when our legs hurt, knees hurt, how do we know it hurts? We feel it. So, the pain, like let's say in the leg, it's a physical because it's the body consciousness. Of the 6 consciousnesses, there are 5 sense consciousnesses and 1 mental. So my body consciousness, whatever sensations are in my body, well, the sensations already says it. The word sensation means it's a mental sensation. So there's some nerves and there's some, electrical impulses that go through the nerves. That is not pain. But that leads to a body consciousness that experiences the feeling of pain. Now that is a consciousness. So the physical, when we talk about physical consciousness, there's no contradiction because really it's a body consciousness. It's a consciousness that perceives these happenings in the body. And really in the body, it's just impulses. I don't know how it really works, but I guess how does pain is created through the nerves? So they're like electrical impulses? Is that... Pardon? Yeah, neurotransmitters passing on whatever they pass on. But that's not pain. That's not pain. Pain is what we experience with the mind. So we call that the body consciousness. And we speak of physical pain because it is only picked up if you have a body. So can you see there's actually no contradiction? It's a type of mind, a consciousness, that is very strongly connected to the body. All it picks up is sensations in the body. Heat, cold, hunger, thirst, someone scratching you, someone giving you a massage, someone punching you. All this, and the body consciousness picks up any sensation in the body, if it pays attention. Yes?
Can I make the difference between pain and suffering?
Okay, good question. Can you draw a distinction between pain and suffering? Very good question, because here the problem is again semantics. The problem is the words that are used in English after translating a Tibetan word. But the problem in English is there in Tibetan too, because everyday spoken Tibetan and philosophical Tibetan is slightly different. So you have the word for suffering is dunge, which usually suffering is seen as something, I see it as suffering. I interpret it as being a suffering, right? So that is true. In Tibetan language, you say pain is a different word in ordinary Tibetan language. The word for pain and the word for suffering are different. And they use it the same way we do in English. But in the philosophy, the blanket term for anything unpleasant is suffering. Dunge. That is the blanket term. So a pain is dunge, is suffering. An unpleasant feeling is suffering. A frustration is suffering. So it's just a blanket term. That's why, because in English suffering has a different connotation, that's why a lot of translators like to use the word dukkha, because it doesn't mean anything. It's a word that's easy to say, easy to write down, and it doesn't mean anything to us. So then people like to use the word, the suffering of dukkha. I can use that word. No problem. But I use the word suffering because it's more often used. And we might as well, if you want to continue and read some of those books, better get used to the vocabulary, the earliest, you can, and then later on that problem won't arise. So if you could just remember, like, suffering here just means any unpleasant experience. Okay, any unpleasant experience we talk of as suffering. So our day-to-day, our kind of like usual sense of suffering, in that right now doesn't work. That word needs to be used, like a different word needs to be used. Does that make sense? Does it? So suffering means any unpleasant feeling. That's called suffering. Right? It's, yes.
Would it be fair to say that when I say physical suffering,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a short way to say I experience an unpleasant feeling caused by physical pain.
Exactly. No, I wouldn't even call that caused by physical pain. Caused by physical sensations. Yeah. Because pain is already saying, it's yeah. It's true. In Tibetan, it's actually saying suffering of the body. So we use the word physical, but usually they talk about suffering of the body. So associated with the body. Of doesn't necessarily mean the same as in English. So you see, there's a lot of semantics, and I'm glad you bring up these points, like the word suffering. Anytime you feel that something doesn't make sense, you should say so, because sometimes it's only the way the words are used. The vocabulary is used in a very specific way, the way it was used in Tibet, or the way it is used in Tibetan. And sometimes when you feel you don't understand something, it's not that you don't understand the meaning, you just don't understand how the word is used, and needs to be explained. Yes, please.
But you can feel pain without suffering.
Ah, okay. You can feel, see, you use the word again in the ordinary sense. You can feel pain without suffering. But the problem is, in Tibetan you would say, since there is pain, there is suffering. Right? So the word suffering just means any pain is, so what you just expressed, and this is the sentiment that exists, like I say, in Tibetan, you talk about suffering a mental pain. Right? You speak of it as a mental pain. And that is actually, it's totally true what you're saying. It is true, because the worst suffering is the mental suffering. And we can choose to ignore a physical suffering and be just as happy. Right? And so then we have both. We have suffering and we have happiness. The body consciousness experiences suffering, and the mental consciousness experiences happiness. So then, of course, since the mental consciousness is the most dominant one, we are right. Yeah? But that doesn't mean we don't have physical suffering. We still have physical suffering, but it doesn't bother us. Yeah? Okay. So those were some good points that you just made here. So to just summarize, any kind of pain is also called a suffering. But of course, the mental type of suffering is considered far worse. And we're dealing much more here with mental sufferings than we deal with physical sufferings. Okay.
Can you please explain what does it mean? You mentioned body consciousness.
Body
Body
consciousness.
is not consciousness. What does it mean body consciousness?
Oh, body consciousness. So body is not a consciousness. There seems to be a contradiction here in terminology. Actually, we speak of 6 types of consciousness. Mental consciousness is easiest. The mental consciousness. It's called mental because it's not directly associated with any of the senses. Okay? Mental consciousness, you have that even if you don't have eyes, ears, nose, you have none of the senses, you still always have a mental consciousness. That is the one consciousness you always possess. And then there are 5 other ones, sense consciousnesses, that are associated with the senses that you don't always have. When is the time you don't have a sense consciousness? Within the last 24 hours. When? Pardon? The last 24 hours. When you slept. Exactly. During the time of sleep, the sense consciousnesses, they're all absorbed. They're not there. There's only the mental consciousness. So while you sleep, even during deep sleep, there is consciousness. Just aware of nothing. Okay? All right. Or unless you're dreaming, So the body consciousnesses, the word that they use, it's kind of giving the name of the cause to the result. So when we say I consciousness, the I gives rise to that particular consciousness. So we talk about I consciousness, when actually it is the main thing that gives rise to that experience is the I. That's why. Okay? So in the same way we talk about, wheat sprout, right? You have a wheat seed, a barley seed, for example, that gives rise to a barley sprout. So the barley is really that little grain thing, but we still say the barley sprout, because the cause is the barley which gave rise to the sprout. So likewise here, the I gave rise to the I consciousness. So the body gave rise to the body consciousness. So we're giving the name of the cause to the result. Does that make sense? We do it all the time. Giving the name of the cause to the result. Right? When do you do it? I have a lot of sun in my room. Oh, you do not have sun in your room. You don't want sun in your room. You wouldn't have a room if you had sun in your room, right? So it's like the rays of the sun, you have those in your room, but you don't have the sun in your room. Okay? All right. Anyway, so after this discussion, I think it's pretty clear. You have 6 types of consciousness, 5 of them very strongly associated with the senses, and whatever information the senses provide, being taken on by the consciousness, there's usually an experience of pleasure, displeasure, or a neutral feeling. Okay? So then you have already a suffering here. When you talk about an unpleasant feeling, it's called a suffering. All right. Now, anyway, here, this is exactly what I've said here on page 9. Basically, I'd summarized. Well, no, this is a summary of what I've just been speaking about. On page 9, you find a summary of this. When the Buddha said that our mind and body are a truth of suffering, he's basically saying, as long as we have this mind and body, the potential to suffer is always there. Okay? And we're not supposed to suffer. All right. Now, according to Buddhist psychology, as I just said, there are 3 types of feeling that accompany any kind of consciousness: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feeling. Right? I've already said that. Okay? So, of those 3, now just to kind of say what I've said in the text here too, so a few things I will always read. So of those 3, pleasant and unpleasant feeling cover a vast spectrum of different experiences. Okay? So suffering, if you say suffering or happiness, so pleasant, unpleasant. Suffering, happiness. Pleasant feeling and happiness are the same. Unpleasant feeling and suffering are the same. And they cover a vast spectrum of feelings. So pleasant feelings include feelings of pleasure, happiness, joy, elation, euphoria, bliss, delight, rapture, well-being, enjoyment, satisfaction, exaltation, and so forth. Thanks to thesaurus. Like the synonyms. And yeah, so I looked at all those. All right. I can never say thesaurus, yeah, whatever. Okay, unpleasant feelings include feelings of displeasure, dissatisfaction, frustration, unhappiness, worry, discomfort, suffering, misery, pain, depression, sadness, distress, gloom, despair. Oh my God, there are even more. Sorrow, hurt, and so forth. Okay, so suffering I've included here, suffering more in the sense of like stronger type of suffering. Okay, but in the more, the kind of philosophical way, really, it's like unpleasant feeling, suffering. Same idea. Okay? So just if you can remember that, and then it's easier. Neutral feelings refer to feelings that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and thus none of the feelings above. Okay. So this should suffice. So feelings are mental factors and thus awarenesses associated with one of the 5 sense consciousnesses. So they're just these functions that come along with any kind of consciousness. And then you have a list of these 6 consciousnesses here, and with each consciousness there's always a type of feeling. All right, so I don't need to read through them. You can read through them on your own. But of course, when do those feelings arise? As a result of perceiving a certain object. Right? So in association with an object, there's a particular object we perceive, and that gives rise to a feeling. Okay? All right, so let's say, for example, in your body, there's a certain sensation you perceive. And, for example, when you sit, okay, you meditate, there's it starts off with just a tiny sensation. It's not unpleasant yet. The awareness does not perceive it as unpleasant yet. It may just be neutral. It may even be pleasurable. Let's say someone gives you a massage. You start off, oh, it's so good, And then slowly, the sensation right? It changes, and so the experience of it is different. So first it's a pleasurable experience, then it's neutral, and then it turns into suffering, right? So it's like the mind, according to the object, since the object changes, the experience also changes. Does that make sense? Yeah? And so, of course, if you look at your own mind, objects change all the time. The eyes perceive something new in each moment. I mean, don't stare at things all the time. And besides, these objects we stare at are changing moment by moment anyway. So even without us being aware, each moment there is a different object actually appearing. Okay? Then sounds, smells, sounds, they're always changing at all times. And of course, mentally, oh my God, if you start meditating and become aware, I think even a movie, if you put it on fast play, it's still not as fast as our own mind. Right? The images in our mind, they're going to be so rapid. I don't think if you fast forward a movie, well, maybe if you fast it forward and maybe, so they get that same sense. But our mind is very, very fast, different objects, all the time. And then pleasant experiences, non-pleasant experience, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, both and back and forth, back and forth. Does that make sense? Ring true? Okay. All right. So that's just the basis for explaining the Four Noble Truths. Without explaining, yes, Vada?
You said that the body is the cause of I'm not so sure.
The body consciousness, yes, it gives rise.
Cause of suffering. It's in the body, but isn't the object also a cause for tools of suffering?
No, I didn't say that. If
Not a cause. You did say cause. I don't remember the.
no, the body is a cause that gives rise to a body consciousness, right? First,
In regards to the tools of suffering.
in regard to the truth of suffering. Well, I mean, the body consciousness is a truth of suffering. And the body is also a truth of suffering. What I said was initially I was saying that a truth of suffering is the cause of suffering. A truth of suffering, so the body is a cause of suffering. Not the main cause, but having this body means we experience suffering.
So isn't the object also a part of the cause that makes the body have a truth of suffering, be used like a truth of suffering?
What do you mean?
Imprints of the body would be, or imprints in the mind would be truth of suffering, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, all of those, they're all truth of suffering.
An outside object would.
An outside object can also be a truth of suffering. Yes, it's not just the body, but we'll speak more about this. Yes, we'll speak more about this. But anyway, basically, truth of suffering means something that gives rise to a suffering. So even the external world is seen as a truth of suffering. Okay? But basically, let's narrow it down right now to mind and body. They're most important. Okay. Now, having given all this explanation, having explained those three types of feelings, now we can talk about the three types of suffering. There's said to be three types of suffering. Okay? So without understanding feeling properly, it'll be difficult to understand them. Yes, please.
Is there anything that does not have the potential to cause suffering?
Good question. Is there anything that does not have the potential to cause suffering? Good question. Okay. I don't want to answer this, but I want to keep this as one of those questions that as we go along, maybe you'll find an answer yourself. So I don't want to answer it. Okay? But that's a very good question. Is there anything that in our case would not cause any suffering? And I have just very roughly explained a truth of suffering because I've only explained it from the point of view of giving suffering. And actually there's more to it. But if I explain this already now, it gets too confusing. We look more at the cause that gave rise to the object. So calling something a truth of suffering actually depends on the cause that produced it. Right? So you can hear already cause and effect become very important. They are confusing, but they're only confusing right now. As we go along, it'll become clearer. So don't be disheartened when you hear cause, effect, and all this, because I'm just giving you like a rough outline. So it's still confusing, but it'll be cleared. Anyway, going back to those 3 types of suffering. So there are 3 types. And they can only be really understood when you understand the 3 types of feeling. Okay? Especially the second one is always misunderstood. And the most difficult to understand is the 3rd type. So the first type is easy. The second type is always misunderstood, often misunderstood. And the 3rd, very difficult to understand. Right? So you're already prepared. If you don't understand the 3rd one, don't be frustrated. And if you get confused with the second one, well, it's pretty normal. Okay, so the 3 types of suffering. But only one of them is actual suffering. Okay? So the other ones are called types of suffering, but they're not suffering in the actual sense. Because suffering really is actual suffering. It's unpleasant feelings. So they're called the 3 types of suffering, but they're not all of them actual types of suffering. Okay? But we'll see why they're called that. So it's how